Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. We have still some interesting topics for this week. Obviously, we got the confirmation yesterday that we would be getting something next week on February 19th, which we most likely think is going to be the iPhone SE 4. And while that is what we were going to get in terms of official announcements, maybe something else, iPad Airs, MacBook Airs, AirTag 2, right? That thing was also rumored, or those things. We are still living in the world of Apple news and rumors, so we are still constantly getting new reports about what might come out, about what those things might look like and how they might work, what they might be powered by. And this is what where we are today, and this is what we're gonna do today, because front page tech, I think all of you guys know, for the famous eyebrow incident regarding the I believe it was regarding the Apple Watch redesign, but there were a lot of rumors at one point coming from Prasser from front page tech. They have died down a little, or a lot actually, but recently they have kind of been resurging a bit. So we covered their leaks and rumors about the potential redesign of the iOS 19 camera app, looking very much Vision OS like. Let's see if that means the entirety of iOS 19 will see such a redesign. A lot of speculation about that after Apple released the Invites app, which also has very clear inspirations from Vision OS. But that's also not what we're going to talk about today, because yes, just a few hours ago, or this morning my time or something like that, we got actually a new video by Front Page Tech, and it's getting a lot of coverage right now on all the typical Apple news and rumors websites, about the potential design about the iPhone 17 Pro. Now, this specific design is actually something we have talked about, or at least briefly mentioned, when it comes to several YouTube or several Twitter leakers, or Weibo or whatever. Stuff gets regurgitated back and forth. It's really hard to tell at this point where some info originates. But for example, Majin Buu has been showing stuff like that, and I have criticized him in the past, or them, I don't know. And but now this does give some of the stuff that has been surfacing on the internet a little bit more credibility. Not because FPT is perfect, but I usually give them some benefit of the doubt if they actually go out with a big video. It's not like a short tweet that they just leave out. We're gonna react to the design renders that they created here for the iPhone 17 Pro. They also made a statement about the dynamic island changing or not. So that will actually be continuing something we talked about just yesterday. So yeah, this is really something I couldn't neglect, because I also see people really confused by some of the things here. I do think, by the way, this is a weird design overall. I do have some possible explanations and some improvements that I think are going to happen in the real world, in a way that I don't think, for example, people usually account for. Think about how, for example, the original like stove top, like that triangular design, looked in earliest leaks and rumors. It looked really bad. Then we found out it's more of a square that goes around those triangles. And the end design, thanks to that elevated glass and stuff like that, actually ended up, in my opinion, pretty nice, and it made it very much iconic. There has been plenty of decisions between the eye that turned out to be the dynamic island, the cutout on the screen that people were not sure how it was going to look. The notch ended up, in my opinion, a far smaller issue than many thought it was going to be. Many people thought, oh my god, this is going to like scar Apple's reputation as like design company. People will hate that like one portion of their screen is not perfect or whatever. That didn't happen. So that's not to say that I think all of Apple's designs are automatically gonna succeed, but in my opinion, I feel like a lot of people are a tiny bit overreacting at this point. So, and obviously, once we look at the video in more detail and how those renders look in a smooth transition and stuff like that, I'll actually have some positive things to say too. This is not copium. I actually mentioned one of the potential upsides of this design in a previous video, so I am actually internally consistent. I still think it looks weird to put the flash and the LiDAR scanner so far away from the regular camera. It honestly makes me wonder if Apple just found something way better to put in those places here. It also makes me wonder how this triangular camera design is going to scale down to the non-pro models and the Air, or whatever they're going to call that iPhone 17 Slim. Like, is it just going to be like one camera and still like a super elongated bar? Or is it gonna maybe stay similar to the iPhone 16 design? Because a lot of people really like that design. So maybe Apple might want to make a redesign that is like iPhone Pro exclusive. Again, we have seen also some weird renders about what the iPhone 17 Air might look like, with basically just one camera, one elongated bar, and then the flash, the flash on the other side, and the microphone. So again, could be, could not be, but I just really wanted to comment on it all. Let me briefly check. My OBS thus far is still perfect. 0 lost frames. Let's hope it really stays that way. But as always, let me informed how the audio quality is working for you, the video quality is working for you. And now that we are a little bit into the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet done so. Like the video, share it out with anybody who you think might enjoy it. Comment. I enjoy interacting with a lively live chat. You guys know that. But if you cannot leave a comment live, please leave one afterwards. You can also support this channel directly with a small donation in the form of a super chat or super sticker. You can become a channel member right here on YouTube. Shout out to Angelica, Steve, and Maximus, who are all MarkTech Pro Max supporters here on YouTube. Or you can become a supporter over on Patreon. So many ways to interact with the community. Help us grow. Help us get more attention. Thank you so much. Tipo Master, yeah, I don't know about this one from FPT. Would the LiDAR and flash being far instead of always close coupled to the cameras work? It would definitely work. And we'll get into the details once we look at the video. If you consider like this isn't too far away. Even on a Pro Max, the phone is not gigantic. When you consider, for example, a real camera, quote unquote, right? That flash can be pretty far apart. Plus, I would also argue sometimes a flash being slightly apart is actually better. It does, when you actually see it, one thing that does also help even today's iPhone camera arrangement is that those cameras do not exist on the same plane as the LED flash, right? They're slightly elevated. They have those metal outlines that prevents like lens flaring coming right from the flash. The LiDAR scanner, I don't know. The way it works, I don't think it would be a problem being a little bit away from the cameras. I do think just algorithmically, it's most likely beneficial for it to stay closer to the cameras. That way, like your 0 point, right, in the world, if you consider like all the axes in a 3-dimensional environment, it's obviously better to have all of them closer around one spot. But I also don't think that the smartphone is so large that this would create issues. There's also that having them in one corner lets a user know not to keep fingers there, but the LiDAR seems prone to it if split out. Yeah, I've seen people comment in general that the pixel design where, and like, let's say what people call like that visor design, right? It starts a little bit lower, right? And then the cameras are like obviously horizontally aligned. And people say that you would put the finger then right on top. And then it would rest on that camera visor. Here, you would have to put the camera, you would have to put your finger exactly at the edge of the device, which is obviously not as comfortable. or down here, which would require from going like this to more like this, which is not very natural. So you would have to kind of like rest your finger across this area. So depending on your finger size and your hand size, you could be covering the flash, you could be covering the LiDAR scanner, you could even be partially covering both, or at least kind of the microphone is where I would see the biggest problem, right? Seems like the most natural position would kind of be for one of your fingers to cross around here. Again, you don't really have to do that. People have held their smartphones right around like the chassis for years. I know it's getting more difficult to do so now that the phones are larger and larger. But I also don't think that Apple is going to consider those small niche things. Not to say that camera usage is a niche thing, but I do not believe that, like, oh, you cannot learn this, right? I believe that, yeah, a niche subset of users will have issues with that, but I think the majority will be able to kind of cope and deal around that. But yeah, let's actually look at the video. Let's see the way they present it. Let's see their own theories. There's one thing about the video I would really like to criticize. There's also one thing I would really like to bring up in context of all the recent Apple criticism stuff when it comes to Samsung specifically. Again, this does not have anything to do with the iPhone 17 Pro, this specific design leak. It's just something that has really bugged me recently, especially with all the stuff about Apple Intelligence being delayed and Apple supposedly, or like the Tailosive Tech video, right, where Apple has become IBM and shit like that. So it's the one point being brought up again and again, and I feel like at this point it's just regurgitated, reheated garbage without any actual like new thought. Let's just react to this. Let's go full screen. Should be full HD. Let's get started.
Is iPhone 17 Pro.
Why do they doubt the kid? I'm about to prove them all wrong again.
So this is the wrong design, right? This is basically almost a one-to-one copy of what the Pixel visor with that horizontal camera arrangement looks like. I never thought Apple was going to go a route that was so clearly recognizable as something that was previously done by a competitor. If it had really big benefits to the insides, I think they could have. Like some people have said, oh, the motherboard would be entirely redesigned. It would get a central placement to make heat dissipation better and things like that. It wouldn't be right on the top, because on the top it competes in terms of space with the components housed in the notch or dynamic island, the camera, the Face ID sensors, the front-facing speaker, the antennas on the top, and things like that. It's not a perfect design given today's current internal iPhone layout, but it could potentially work, especially if those cameras are highly elevated.
Got a low tolerance, 'cause they don't even know what the problem is. It's me.
Well, that's what it looks like according to the rumors.
Is this sped up? No. Good.
Spoiler, it does not. This year is going to be a very, very important year for the iPhone. After last year's less than stellar iPhone releases, for the first time since like the Ice Age, Apple is getting a little scrappy, taking some chances and trying some new things.
Okay, so this to me is already bullshit, because I hate framing everything around like, oh, you didn't try new things until you like do a full-on redesign. You guys understand, sometimes a full-on redesign is actually easier because you can let go of existing conventions, you can truly try something new, but the end result is just not guaranteed to be good. There is a reason why existing knowledge and existing paradigms do exist and have been established. Apple has tried and done a lot of things that are different, innovative, or at least different again. Sometimes maybe for the sake of being different, but often with clear intent. The titanium body. Now you could argue, oh, aluminum is still better for heat dissipation, aluminum is still lighter than titanium, but Apple has been on stainless steel, and Apple has clearly valued durability and some marketing power of a more premium material, and they switched it around. They went with titanium. They didn't actually increase the base price of the Pro models. They introduced the action button, more customizable than the previous mute switch. They introduced camera control, not just a simple camera trigger, but an actually like very expensive design, very intricate about potentially like swiping and holding down before you actually press. And like, yeah, you can argue with specific implementations. Like a lot of people have argued that, for example, the camera control does not sit in a perfect position for most people. And yeah, I can absolutely agree with that. But the idea that Apple hasn't changed stuff because, oh, they were basically lazy, like the dynamic island dates back only to the 14 Pros. Since then, the 14 Pros have had slimmer bezels than the 13 Pros, and the 13 Pros had a different notch than the 12 design, and the 12 design was a complete redesign, and we got that tri-camera design only with the 11 Pro series, right? And then we got even slimmer bezels on the 15 Pros, and then even slimmer bezels than that on the 16 Pros. So this idea that Apple is not doing things to advance the iPhone's design just because the camera arrangement on the back stays the same is complete and utter bullshit, in my opinion. Ducky Boy, sorry to say that, but the new design looks like the Xiaomi 11 Ultra. Let me actually look at it. Doesn't the Xiaomi 11 Ultra have wait, the 11 Ultra? So that's an older generation. How did that look? Yeah, that looks pretty similar. I actually don't disagree. I would say Samsung has been worse than Apple in changing things over the last year. I would say that Samsung, I actually, like, you guys will dislike this take of mine, but I actually like when companies stick to something that works if they find that it actually works. Like, okay, we have the Xiaomi 11 Ultra. You guys see I have zero problems admitting that this will look similar to that. I don't think that you can design pretty much anything on a smartphone right now that looks entirely new. Pretty much everything has been tried, at least by some niche product. But then look at the Xiaomi 12 Ultra, right? Now this is the 12 Pro. So this is the 12 Ultra. Oh, here's like the 12S Ultra. So we have a rectangular design with a circular thing, not quite in the middle. That looks horrible. So this was clearly just a change for change's sake. You could have easily unified those things. And in fact, right now they are basically only with a circular elevation, the Xiaomi 13 Ultra. So that one now stayed with just a circular design, or was there still like a rectangular elevation? No. Okay, so I actually appreciate that evolution. And now look at the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. You'll find now they are sticking with that camera design that is very much able to create tryptophobia panic attacks, but it is at this point a recognizable design. And this is the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. When you look at Huawei did that kind of design over half a decade ago, right? So this, you could have said the same thing when you saw initial leaks and rumors about these phones, where like, you know what? This is a design that has existed in the past. And looking at the Xiaomi 15 Ultra that will be soon introduced, oh, we can use the Huawei Mate X here, by the way, too, right? So we have a circular cutout with like semi-angular elements. This clearly just exists to slightly visually differentiate its camera bump from the rest of the Xiaomi lineup. Really not a fan of it. especially not for $2,000. But yeah, and now the Xiaomi 15 Ultra basically gets a little bit of this two-tone design on the back, but the camera stays this circular elevation, similar how the iPhone has stuck around for years with that triangular camera arrangement inside a rectangular elevation. They changed it a little bit. Find an image of the Xiaomi 13 from the site. The Xiaomi 13, the regular model. We can look at that. Yeah. So they basically adopted it a little bit. Like, it wouldn't make sense to make this like a wholesale left to right thing here. But basically, when you think about it, actually, what is the at that point, a lot of people could have said this is very similar to the iPhone's arrangement, right? It's not it's not exactly triangular in the way the iPhone is, right? Because the iPhone has basically ein gleichschenkliges Dreieck in German. So that's where all sides of the triangle are the same. Here you would obviously have one clear along the side, but it's a triangular camera arrangement inside a rectangular bump. So, and the 13 Ultra, we already looked at it. So that one had like a yeah, but like the cameras are slightly differently arranged inside. They change a little bit of the back and shit like that. I don't think that any of that really counts as huge, meaningful changes that Apple has not been able to at least do with like different color choices or their switch to titanium. Desert 67, I haven't seen you in a while. Hey Mark, have you seen those AI photo comparisons between the 16 Pro Max and the Galaxy S24 Ultra? S24 Ultra. I don't know what you mean. Do you mean like the Magic Eraser from Google Gemini and Cleanup? Because I do admit that Magic Eraser at this state of the game has been better than Cleanup, but I do think that people are kind of misusing Gemini or what Galaxy AI, excuse me, because they will just delete the central element of the photo. And even Apple executives have come out and they said like Cleanup is not designed to change the composition of your image. Cleanup is designed to remove something small in the background or shit like that. I feel like if you are gonna praise Samsung for something, I would much more praise them for a feature like removing, for example, reflections, right? You were shooting something, there was a transparent piece of glass, but every piece of glass still reflects a little bit, right? Removing that to me seems cool, seems actually useful. But when it comes to Cleanup and Magic Eraser or features that are basically derived from Magic Eraser, I always ask myself, like, yeah, remove like a small bush from the background, or a piece of dirt from a beautiful beach or something like that. But people took like an upfront image of their hand, right, holding a smartphone or something like that, and then they made Magic Eraser or Galaxy AI or whatever delete that smartphone, and with generative fill, that AI just drew their hand. Now, it obviously made some shit up. Like, people were saying, oh, my face looks like my face, but I look a little bit chubbier or a little bit thinner, or it gave me like a double chin or something like that. But like, it's still scary good at how much it filled in. But that's like, what is that point of it? If you wanted a photo of your actual hand, you would have taken a photo of your actual hand. If you're taking a selfie by like making an image in the mirror, right, you will not cover your face if the focus was covering your face. So that's my problem. I do not actually complain that Gemini or Galaxy AI are not better. I do believe that even for removing smaller background objects, which I believe it should be the main purpose of this tech, is better. But that usually is better when you make it run on the cloud, which again, Apple has promised to make some stuff run on private cloud compute. So I do believe that Apple should not limit themselves to only on-device processing, but there are explanations for certain limitations of Apple's AI right now. Plus, all of Apple's AIs are constantly being updated. Like iOS 18.3 had some different LLMs than, or updated LLMs than 18.2. I'm sure iOS 18.4 will further improve things, especially as they are targeting a wider audience. They will be learning from even more data sets and stuff like that. But yeah, like, so it's kind of this weird conundrum where I have zero problem saying, oh, Gemini, Magic Eraser, Galaxy AI, they are better, but they are not that much better, because that one use case that people show where it is a lot better, like transformatively better, I don't think that's an actual use case. If I wanted to edit an image that much, I would go into Photoshop. If you use cleanup for arranging the composition, you might as well just make it imagine in Photoshop. Exactly, Ducky Boy. I 100% agree. Desert 67, you're saying valid points. You see, guys, I ramble sometimes, but I do try to make a final point in the end. So I'm very glad. My point is not here to tell Apple, oh, Apple, please stop improving your LLMs. It's good enough, right? Cleanup, it's only designed for small objects. It doesn't need to be perfect. No, hell no. It needs to be perfect. But for those smaller objects, those little imperfections, things like that, I would even argue make some beauty stuff for cleanup, right? Like if somebody has something on their face they really don't want, like give you the ability to just clean it up nicely while still preserving like a smooth but natural skin, real skin tones and stuff like that. Do that, but don't allow the AI to just draw 80% of a covered up face. Like that's just weird, man. And especially, what if it's like somebody in the photo who looks a little bit like you, but it's not you? Does the AI then think it's you because so much of the face was covered up, and then it draws your face over somebody else? That's just stuff that I'm honestly, this is where I say, like, this is where AI truly turns wasteful and it truly kills artistic intent. But let's get back to the FPT video.
It's like, finally, this year's iPhone lineup will not look like last year's iPhone lineup. Praise be Tim Cook. He giveth and he taketh away. Mostly taketh.
This is like mostly taketh. We have seen huge expansions of like, I know it's a joke, right? But I do try to often be a little bit more serious than other people, because I've seen, especially in the gaming community, which after like raw tech, like smartphones and Apple specifically, is the nerd community I most interact with. And I've seen jokes turn from actually like, oh, there's a little bit of truth in it, but we know it's not actually true. Hee hee ha ha, right? And I feel like sometimes those jokes, they turn into sincerely held beliefs that actually really harm the mindsets, not the minds. I'm not saying it turns people insane, but they hurt the mindsets of people in the long term. I've seen that, and I've covered that again in yesterday's stream, where I mentioned Sony's recent state of play, where people are just so obsessed with the idea that Sony does not have enough first-party games that they complain about the state of play that showed a new first-party game, which is Saros from Housemarque, right? But because they thought, oh, I need to see more Ghost of Yotei, which, yeah, I do want to see more Ghost of Yotei too, but Ghost of Yotei is most likely getting its own standalone state of play later in the year. They were like, oh, why not a new Death Stranding 2 trailer? Well, Death Stranding 2 is getting a huge showcase at South by Southwest in March. Why not something for the God of War anniversary? God of War's anniversary is next month. It's not right now. Like, there's so many like, why not show more of Intergalactic? And like, why not show more of the thing that people hated last time? And you pretty much only had cinematics. but now you want them to show more cinematics because gameplay is clearly not yet ready. What exactly are you asking for? And I feel like the same thing is happening sometimes with Apple, where people will be like, oh, Apple has not done shit. Like this design that I see like 50% of people wear around, men mostly though, like people who were previously wearing regular Apple Watches, that design goes back just 2 years ago. Apple Watch Apple Watch Ultra 1 basically was introduced in 2023, was introduced in 2022, right? Then got an update in 2023 to the Apple Watch Ultra 2, and got no update in 2024, right? So 2.5 years, something like that, right? There's a ton of changes that is constantly happening around Apple that I feel like people just ignore, and it's sometimes huge redesign, huge conceptual changes. Even my MacBook, right, with all those new ports, the choice between M series, M Pro series, and M Max chips, right? That goes back to only late 2021. So I always get confused when people are like, Tim Cook taketh away. What has he taken away? The last few years have been incredible, like tandem OLED on iPads, the bigger proliferation of nano-textured glass on both iPads and Macs, even like the beloved iPad Mini for John Prosser has seen updates, and it's a whole different rant. I'm not trying to say Apple is perfect, but I would prefer for people to make real criticisms. Chilling with Lewis, yo, what's up, homie? What's up, bro? I wish Touch Unlock came back to the iPhones and Face Unlock for the Macs. Well, now you know why Apple. The inconsistency here of your argument is very interesting. Touch ID being something that could be brought to the power button is an interesting thing, because the problem is that both Touch ID, both Face ID take up space, not much each, right? And they both cost some money, Face ID being more expensive than Touch ID, right? So actually, if you consider it, some might say, oh, doesn't it make more sense for Apple to go back to Touch ID, because Touch ID is cheaper and actually takes up a little bit less space than Face ID, right? That would be like the perfect Tim Cook move. Like, oh, saving money and not actually getting rid of features. But it would be getting rid of features, right? Face ID for all its potential downsides versus just putting your button on it. For example, Face ID works while you're wearing gloves. Now, Touch ID works while you're wearing a mask, but Face ID does too, thanks to the improvements they made during the pandemic. Face ID can provide 3D data. It can provide 3D data of your actual face for stuff like Animoji, but also whatever other like AR app you might want. Face ID can also help as basically as any kind of LiDAR similar scanner with focusing from the front facing camera. We've seen both on the back and in the front that iPhone's cameras are actually extremely good at focusing even in lower light, because they have those sensors that do not depend on light. So that is an advantage that would be going away if Apple took away Face ID. And if you're suggesting we get both Face ID and Touch ID in the same device, now you're asking for two features, some that might sometimes basically like counter each other, right? Like what happens if Face ID doesn't recognize you, but Touch ID does? Like, that's a little bit weird to trust you in that case, or the other way around. What if the finger clicking the power button is your finger, but you're doing so over somebody sleeping or whatever? Again, it could be solved, and you could create your own preferences on device. Guys, thank you for the very active chat. As always, a small reminder, if you make it a super chat, I'm guaranteed to read it, give you a shout out and stuff like that, and it all gets reinvested right back in the channel. Again, just do whatever you can afford, whatever you want. Just a small warning. So I know I'm rambling. Let me briefly get at the chat, saying what you guys are agreeing on or disagreeing with. You can just put your finger on this touch unlock to get into my phone, or 2 taps on the power button to unlock it. Giving people choices is bullshit, because choice also comes down to what is in the device. If Face ID is not there, that's not choice anymore. That's now a different thing. And if it's both in there, now you have to consider the fact now you have two features or two hardware things doing the same thing, both taking up space and both costing money, which, yeah, I know Apple's margins are good, but those margins are not good because they put redundant shit into the device. To be honest, I'd like Touch ID more. That is a better argument, right? If you argue for Touch ID to replace Face ID, I actually understand that. I don't. I actually have pretty big sweat glands. I have never worked too well with fingerprint sensors. Unfortunately, so to me, Face ID has always been a godsend, but I do understand that argument, Ducky Boy. Chilling with Lewis, Face ID is nice, but I want both. Well, maybe Apple could create like an Ultra model. I've always argued there is probably some space above the Pro Max, especially if they ever return the Pro lineup to aluminum, which would bring down the weight. That I think that, and bring down a little bit of the cost. I always thought that could leave room for like a $14.99 iPhone Ultra, maybe even with the same screen size as the Pro Max, but I don't know, like more memory, bigger camera sensors, maybe one extra camera, like kind of how the Chinese devices are handling Ultra. And maybe at that point, Apple could also advertise it to businesses saying for maximum security, you can like use Touch ID and Face ID at the same time, right? Obviously, there would be more than enough margin if a product was that expensive. So something like that, maybe that could work. Hey, brother, I wanted to know, when will you do a call-in show? Like, get people on StreamYard during your YT lives. I would super chat for that, bro. Actually, I've thought of doing that. I should probably come up with a permanent solution for that. I think I actually promised it at the end of last year, and there are two promises that I still intend to keep. First is I do want to create a nice chart with benchmarks across the A18 chip, the Snapdragon 8 Elite, and probably also something for the M series, but mobile would be my priority because I think it's actually easier already to find benchmarks for the M series chips simply because of the different benchmarks that exist on desktop. But the other point is I did promise to create a Discord for you guys. And with Discord, I assume this is when I would introduce stuff like call-in. I do think that that would make sense. Jan asking, do I know if there are any news coming from Apple today? Well, today is Friday. That makes it very unlikely that, for example, we would see iOS 18.4 Beta 1. Quite honestly, I think everything is happening next week. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw iOS 18.4, the first beta, on like Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, Apple introduces the iPhone SE 4. And maybe the week after, there will still be some announcements like a new iPad Air or something like that. But just today, I don't think much else is going to happen. I mean, every Android has fingerprint and Face ID. That's not true. Yeah, Ducky Boy, you're saying it themselves. Their Face ID is shit. Their Face ID, they don't have Face ID, literally. They have a front-facing camera that uses the most basic-ass algorithms that are still spoofable with a photo of your face. That is not the same thing as Face ID. To be honest, imagine an iPhone with the cameras. Yeah, from the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, the Vivo X200 Pro, I absolutely actually agree with that. Like, I absolutely understand that this is something that people would pay extra money for, and I think it would even create almost like a new market or a new opportunity for like reviewers. I feel like the differentiation currently between like the regular iPhone 16 lineup and the 16 Pros, it is so clear, right? Because of ProMotion or not, because 3 cameras versus 2 is a more meaningful change than 4 cameras versus 3. I think that if you had an Ultra device, it could legitimately offer you like enough small crumbs of improvements, but ones that still matter enough that people would be asking, "Oh, is it worth $200 more?" Or I assume it would be more like a almost like $100 price difference, because I assume this would also come with more base storage by default. But let's say Apple reduces storage prices because at some point they have to, right? And it costs you $100 to go from 256 base to 512 gigabytes. So that's $11.99 going up to $12.99. And then you have a $14.99 Ultra, but that one starts at 512 gigabytes. And then that one moves up to 1 terabyte and 2 terabyte, with the 1 terabyte model being removed from the regular Pros. I think that $200 price difference, especially since it's not even 20% of the cost once you are at $1,300, I think it would be worth paying to a lot of people. I just want a 24 to 48 megapixel autofocus selfie camera, touch unlock. Well, the selfie camera, this is a weird thing though, right? Because when you actually look at the specs that most people put in their selfie camera, and I often go to this website here, so I do recommend you guys check it out. But I actually would say that iPhone selfie camera performs pretty good for what it is, and we are getting a 24 megapixel camera this year. Autofocus, the iPhone actually has optical image stabilization, which I know is not the same as autofocus, but you don't really need crazy focus systems on the front-facing camera, especially on a wide one. Apple's is pretty much almost ultra wide, I would argue. But again, detail in implementation always vary. But like iPhone 16 Pro Max, right? That one actually has a pretty bad selfie camera, all things considered. Now, it does have a very good aperture, and 23 millimeters is equivalent to the wide camera on the back, but it is actually one of the wider cameras. Face ID actually does help with focusing and stuff like that, and then again, it does have optical image stabilization. By the way, it does have autofocus. This is dual pixel autofocus, so maybe it's not as good as you would want it to be, but it does have it, right? But it's a pretty small sensor. That's its biggest downside. Compared to the S25 Ultra, for example, you'll find that the main camera has camera. It has a slightly larger sensor, but it doesn't have optical image stabilization. It has a less wide, slower aperture. It does not have Face ID to help it further with focus and things like that. So when you actually look at selfies, even something like the Vivo X200 Pro, for example, a device that has pretty big sensors, like famously, especially like its 200 megapixel telephoto camera, but then you look at its selfie camera, it's a 32 megapixels, but it's actually not very big, doesn't have the widest aperture. It does struggle in low light way more than its other sensors. And I feel like selfies and ultra wides are kind of like where everyone saves money. And that probably comes down to usage, where I think a lot of people use selfies, but I think a lot of people are quite satisfied with selfies. Maybe not in low light, but then I think most people probably aren't very keen on taking a lot of selfies in low light. And ultra wide, I just think that even though I remember the entire discussion, what is more fun versus what is more useful, I think that actually telephoto ended up winning that discussion versus ultra wide. And so even up until this day, a lot of even like very high-end Chinese devices still kind of cheap out on the ultra wide. I don't think how it's possible to fill a 1 terabyte iPhone. Well, I have a 1 terabyte iPhone. Let me promise you, I don't have it filled up, but these options exist for a very specific subset of people. I'm not actually saying that it's very relevant to have like 2 terabyte iPhones, but since 1 terabyte already exists, I kind of don't see them taking that away. Especially since now also like Chinese phones. Don't forget, like 2-3 years ago, it was actually pretty difficult to find Android devices, even with often with 512 gigabyte storage, those devices had those options, but those options almost never went worldwide. Now it's actually pretty easy to find 512 and even 1 terabyte devices, so Apple cannot really go back on their promise to give you high storage configs. They really need a hardware upgrade. Yeah, sure. Do you think if OpenAI did not work with Apple for their Apple Intelligence, would Google Gemini be on the iPhone? Yeah, and Google Gemini will be on the iPhone. And in fact, we will later talk about the exact implementation of AI on Chinese devices, the way that Apple is partnering with both Alibaba and Baidu. And don't forget, by the way, Google Gemini, or at least some version of it, is on the iPhone even before it's being integrated. And it is there in the form of visual intelligence. Visual intelligence relies on the back end of Google Lens, essentially. And while, yes, it's not exactly Gemini, it is a Google AI system. So, and whatever Google labels with Gemini is just complete and utter bullshit. It's just a marketing exercise. So Apple has both ChatGPT and Google AI on their devices. And I'll leave you guys to discuss stuff on between yourself and actually continue it myself. But thank you guys for joining. Thank you for commenting. It's always very fun to have all of you guys here, be so active, and also interact between each other. Let me briefly also look at OBS. We still have, knock on wood, 0 frame drops. Oh my god, my kilobits per second just dropped in half, and I was like, oh my god, am I actually provoking a frame drop right now? But no, but whatever, let's continue.
But this year he giveth. If you don't mind, I would like to talk about the design for a bit, because after all, that's going to be
Ducky
where
boy,
you and most other
Okay, you triggered the nerve of mine. You said you would remove camera control. My question is, have you used camera control? Do you own an iPhone 16 or 16 Pro? I myself, I own a 15 Pro Max, so I don't have camera control on my own iPhone. But over the holidays, through New Year's Eve specifically, I interacted a lot with the 16 Pro Max of my cousin. And I loved camera control. I absolutely loved it.
normies will notice the changes. The rumors and renders that you have been seeing.
Yeah, so there's the two-tone thing where people were saying part of it would be glass, part of it would be metal. Metal would basically help with durability. It would help with... Now, one thing that I do not think is correct, the way they're drawing it here, is to imply that the metal outside would be so notably differently shaded than the metal like on the back, because this was supposed to be a glass cutout that allows for wireless charging, MagSafe connectivity and shit like that. But the metal of the chassis should be much more similar to the metal on the outside. Otherwise, there would be too many different textures. At least that's how I read those original design leaks.
For a bit probably look like this. We've all heard that there is a horizontal camera bar and that the phone would have a cool new two-tone look. The two-tone thing, yeah, fold that up real nice, put it in your back pocket and save it for later.
Don't have
You'll
a
need
pocket
it in
right
like
now,
a few
just
minutes.
gonna
The issue
shove
with
it
having
right
a
back.
camera bar like this is that, well, how do I say this lightly? That is not possible.
I'll answer that question because I actually think this is a very important thing, because I do believe that people are suffering from very much selection bias when it comes to the information they consume. Now, what do I think of Tim Cook? And I will be talking right now about Tim Cook simply as Apple's CEO, right? We can argue about specific things, like maybe you are so pro-America that you want him to build everything in the United States, or you're so cosmopolitan that you actually think that him listening to the law or whatever, that the presidential executive action, I believe it is, that to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America in the Apple Maps app, right? Or going to Trump's inauguration. I'm not here to debate those things. For one, they are very recent, and obviously Tim Cook has been at Apple for decades at this point. He has even been CEO for way over a decade at this point. But about people thinking he's very money oriented, basically almost like a resistance to innovation. And I really have to ask people, like, people think because Apple has grown and their stock market valuation has grown, right? They're like, oh, that's because you have like this bean counter at Apple, right? This extremely anti-innovation person and whatever. But have you forgotten that Apple's profit margins for hardware were exactly that when under Steve Jobs? They were 30, 35, 40%. Apple did not have as many products with different profit margins. Like back then, they didn't have as large, for example, of a service business with things like iCloud, Apple Music, Apple TV Plus, right? But I think that Tim Cook gives the executives at Apple just the right amount of control. Now, some will say, does that mean that Apple is as innovative or at least as tech forward as they could be? No, not always. One can argue, for example, even about smaller things. Like, I would like larger sensors on my iPhone. But people also like to just focus on individual spec points without really understanding what Apple might even be thinking behind it. For example, fast charging, right? Now, fast charging does have its benefits, and I'm glad that Apple has at least gone to like around 30 watts. But fact is, most people don't even charge their phones with like crazy 80, 100, 120 watt chargers. So yes, it's an economical decision for Apple, but it's also a decision that allows for different designs inside the body, right? You don't have to go all out on expensive cooling for the battery, for example. You can have a little bit more space for the speakers, for the microphones, for the haptics, all of which are best in class at Apple, right? Especially for the size of the product, you might sometimes get like a huge brick of a gaming phone with front-facing speakers, and it's simply not something Apple is able to replicate because that's not the design of a product that they're trying to achieve. And then there are other things that people completely neglect. For example, right now, what do we see from Qi 2 Android devices? They are depending on cases. They need to basically have a case with magnets, and that's how they get Qi 2. For Apple, every iPhone going back to the iPhone 12 does have Qi 2 essentially and MagSafe. And Apple has built a big ecosystem around it. In my opinion, MagSafe has been one of the most innovative things in like the last decade in smartphones. There are smaller things that that might not show up as much as RAM, as like the crazy amounts of RAM that you sometimes get. Like OnePlus, I believe, offers up to 24 gigabytes or whatever. But look at satellite connectivity. Not only was Apple realistically the first company to deliver satellite connectivity, but they actually delivered it in a comprehensive way where basically every phone in the world can connect to emergency services. And it's free for 2 years. Apple partnered with a huge company on that. Now Apple is one of the first ones to also get like some extra functionality through carriers like T-Mobile and their cooperation with Starlink, right? Those are all small things. And I'm not denying, for example, that 120 hertz in iPhones showed up a little bit later than on other phones. But Apple waited until they could have not just high refresh, but real variable refresh rate. They did actually so, but even then, you actually have to give them the benefit here because they were actually first with ProMotion on tablets, going back to the 2017 iPad Pro, because they actually pioneered LTPO, because LTPO is a production thing. It actually can exist on both LCD and OLED. And they work together with LG, but Apple is very much credited as kind of the inventor of LTPO. And that's when they had variable refresh rate, not fully variable refresh rate, not like one frame by frame, on iPad. And not only was it good, it was very efficient, well integrated in apps. But then Android, by the time they started rolling out 120 hertz smartphones, a lot of them were not very efficient in the first year, right? That's before they went all out on LTPO. They were also not very well integrated often into a lot of apps, while when Apple used it, basically a few app updates later, every app you use basically supports promotion. And I mean for stuff like scrolling and things like that. Obviously, games do have other limitations. They aren't just limited by the refresh rate of your display, but also by your raw horsepower. So people just, I feel like, underestimate the specific things that Apple does. For example, Apple's periscope camera, or what they call their tetraprism camera. They were by no means the first to like a 5x telephoto. In fact, Samsung, before going back to 5x, actually had 10x telephoto. So some people might say, oh, so what has Apple achieved, right? Look, LG is already giving you variable zoom. And I always say, oh, Apple, please buy that technology and give me variable zoom too. But then there are specific things, the way Apple implements it. For example, their sensor shift optical image stabilization that is both on the main camera and on their 5x telephoto. Those that sensor-based stabilization is so good that Apple's 1x3 inch sized sensor, right? In low light can sometimes beat sensors over twice as large because it can accumulate your data, your light, very quickly because the sensor is stable. Let's put it like that. And again, not saying that Apple is, because of those things, automatically the most innovative, but it is the thing that people forget. And yes, Jan, I am breathing. I know it was a long rant, but I just wanted to mention it because I feel like people try to evaluate Tim Cook almost on the worst things at Apple sometimes. For example, before Apple went with 16 gigs of RAM on the M4 generation, people were basically saying, oh, look, Apple only gives you 8 gigs of RAM because of Tim Cook. And I'm like, did you not see, like, not too long ago, LG were still like offering like 4 gigabyte Windows laptops, like half a decade ago on their website for like $800. Like, don't get those crazy ideas that Tim Cook is somehow like uniquely bad or shit like that. And Apple has launched so many subcategories of products, even brand new products. AirPods launched under Tim Cook. The Apple Silicon transition happened under Tim Cook. Like a giant focus on speakers and stuff like that happened under Tim Cook, not only with standalone products like HomePod, but actually like in your devices too. Before that, Apple was not quite as much known for having like the undeniably best speakers in their respective product category. So yeah, I'm sorry. I know this was a long rant. Hopefully you liked it. Now I'll have to breathe and listen to what John is saying.
Some may say impossible. Have you ever wondered why the iPhone's camera array is laid out in this weird triangle shape? The reason for that at first was, of course, the notch. The old notch on the iPhone took up a lot more room internally than one might assume. That third camera lens is moved down to that weird position because it has to be.
I mean, there's also the equidistance explanation, where the camera lenses are basically all in the same distance to each other. For the main and the ultra wide, you also get like the fact that they, especially now for spatial video, right, that they are vertically on top of each other. So by the time you move your phone, they are horizontally arranged to each other. This is why on dual camera iPhones, where yes, they also had that diagonal layout, Apple actually on the iPhone 16 series went to a fully horizontal arrangement or vertical arrangement, depending on your perspective.
There's quite literally no other room in there. There is no choice, it has to sit below the Face ID array. These days, of course, the notch is gone, but the dynamic island is still taking up a little bit more than island room in there. While it is nice to see renders like this, the people making the renders are just making them from a visual standpoint.
Yep.
They only have to worry about what the outside of the phone might look like. They don't have to consider the internals. 3D renders are not slaves to internal components. But now, hopefully you see why a camera bar like that would just not work.
I mean, it could, like let me actually get back to one point. Desert67 saying, good stuff, Mark. Catch you on the next live chat. Catch you too, Desert67, if you have to go. That's obviously completely fine. It depends, right? If Apple put that camera arrangement right at the very top, it wouldn't work. Obviously, if they put it a little bit more downwards, like the Pixel visor design that we have talked about in the past, it kind of would. So, I mean, it would require still some changes to the dynamic island sensors and shit like that, but it would still work.
Outside of the phone might look like. They don't have to consider the internals.
Okay, so I'm seeing that I'm having frame drops again. Or no, it might just be my iPad. Maybe my 5G is not that good. So OBS still shows 0% frame drops and it doesn't show any encoding overload. So as always, let me know what the quality is for you.
Renders are not slaves to internal components. But now, hopefully you see why a camera bar like that would just not work. As far as I know, the dynamic island will not be shrinking this year. The changes are...
So that is actually the first kind of thing I wanted to cover before we get to the real design, because yesterday we did cover the rumors from Digital Tech Station that in fact on the iPhone 15 Pro Max, the dynamic island would be getting smaller thanks to a meta lens arrangement. Now, whether or not that ends up being untrue, or maybe it's not worth designing a product around just the shrunken down dynamic island specifically of the Pro Max rather than the entire Pro lineup, that I couldn't tell you. So this does counter a rumor that we've covered very, very recently.
Only really on the back of the phone. That leaves us with this many options. That's two of them. There are two options. Option number one does include this entirely horizontal camera bar, but instead moved down a bit to give room for the Face ID array. You've seen renders like this too, I'm sure. It's very Google pixely and pretty. Option number two, however, would be that the camera layout on the back of iPhones actually stays the same. Yeah. Well, good news for you, I have seen the phone, and I'll tell you what the answer is after this sponsor break. Phishing scam, so many alternative number and camera layout is the same. Congratulations, you win. As far as I am aware, the camera layout is staying the same. The same instantly recognizable typical iPhone camera layout. But the rumors of a camera bar on the back, well, those are true. I know, it's confusing. From what we've seen, the phone looks like this. A horizontal...
So now we actually get to the full-on design. One thing that I would like to cover first, and that is that I've seen a lot of people say, oh, those cameras, they will look ridiculous with those cutouts, or like with the very bright metallic rings on a dark surface, with, of course, how bright the lenses look. And let me just tell you, this is not how lenses look in real life. And you know why I know that? Because this is a real photo of the iPhone 15 or 16 Pro Max. And you see that the lenses, while yes, you can see them basically like bending the light, basically like creating almost like a little rainbow inside them, this is not a very prominent effect you're gonna see in your day-to-day usage of this device. Usually the lenses look pretty dark, and that would mean that the cameras actually look kind of pretty neutral on the device. And it also will depend on if that elevation here is actually like metallic, like on the iPhone 10 series, for example, or if it's still 3D glass, right? So if it's basically just the rest of the surface being elevated. Now, if it is 3D glass, then potentially, yeah, a very bright metallic ring around the camera could clash with the rest of the design. But let's say it does have the same metallic finish as the actual chassis, and then it's all around that camera bar, and now those lenses actually match that metallic camera bar surroundment, which would line up kind of like with those early two-tone finish things, because in my opinion, when people were talking about like a metallic camera cutout, that's probably what was meant, rather than this entire part being metal. That never made too much sense to me. So again, just trying to tell you, sometimes the way you do with like a render, it will not reflect some of the problems of real life, but also not all of the help that you get sometimes from real life. Because right now I'm currently looking at the camera arrangement, for example, on my iPhone 15 Pro Max, and because it's using continuity camera to film me, and I don't see like the actual camera lenses at all. I just see like 3 slightly darker circles amidst like a dark blue, because I have the titanium blue option glass. So
looks like this. A horizontal, darker camera bar on the back that is actually much taller than most of the rumors suggest, with the flash, LiDAR, and mic to the right side of the unit. But like I said, same camera layout on the left. Why would they do this? I do not know. I have literally no idea. But
so literally no idea is actually what I kind of came here to criticize, because I do have one really good idea about what this thing could enable. And that is more internal space. In fact, kind of my favorite callback as a device is the Galaxy S2. Right. To anybody who remembers the discussion of the iPhone 4/4S days, these phones competed for the title of the thinnest smartphone, right? And yes, the iPhone 4/4S was largely deemed the thinner one. It wasn't until like the iPhone 5, though, where Apple just clearly won that title. But why would people argue about that? Well, the point is that around here, the Galaxy S2 is actually thinner than the iPhone 4 and 4S. But guess what? You couldn't really fit all the components down below, from the charger to the home button back in the day, to the capacitive sensors, to your speakers, whatever, right? Whatever you needed to have down there resulted in this little bump. It's not a camera bump; it's just a bump. Ironically, I actually always thought that made the device pretty easy to hold, because you could just rest your finger against it while holding it. But this was a major point in why the iPhone 4 or 4S was ultimately deemed to be the thinner smartphone, because this bump was the thickest point, and it made the phone, thicker than the 4 and 4S. But it did give it more internal space where internal space was needed. And I think this could be the main point about this design too. Now, I'm not actually talking about being actually thicker for the cameras, because I do believe that that will just vary on the generation and the specific camera arrangement that Apple needs. But let's say your baseline is whatever thickness that chassis has. Now, currently on iPhone, you have this basically square bump around the triangular camera arrangement, and all that extra thickness that it generates just automatically goes into the cameras, and a very small part maybe to components that are in the notch. With that highly elongated and actually pretty tall camera bar, you now have more internal space all around here. So somewhere around here, this is where you would start to get your processor with a slightly redesigned motherboard. Maybe that could even be slightly taller than that. Don't forget the LED flash and the LiDAR scanner. They're not actually super thick components. So you could still have components underneath them here. And you also have all the Face ID components, so you could potentially have actually a pretty deep front-facing camera. Whether or not that would actually be the case, I don't think necessarily, because the iPhone Air will still exist, and that will kind of be the baseline for Apple to design components for like the front-facing camera around. But on the processor side, obviously you don't want to make your processor thicker for the sake of it. I mean, Apple could use like an AMD like 3D V-cache thing, but the biggest thing that would improve around the processor would be cooling. Right? You could have a much thicker graphene sheet, aluminum stuff, maybe make it all extend into a vapor chamber heatsink, with the thickest spot being right around here for the processor, and then it being pretty thin around where the battery is, right? Stuff like that. Components like the front-facing speaker. You wouldn't necessarily even put a different speaker inside there than you have on like the iPhone 17, the 17 Air, but you could just give it more internal space, right? For the resonance chamber. So obviously, the more space you have here for stuff like antennas, whatever, you could push more components further up. So down here, that leaves actually more space for the battery. So more space here leaves more space here, logically, right? So this is one thing where I'm like, I mean, it wouldn't be a crazy amount of extra space. It would basically be like, I don't know, 1/8 thicker than the rest of the chassis for 1/8 of the back, right? Like if you take this, it's almost like doubling that square camera bump. So that's all the extra space you get. But given how miniaturized modern smartphone technology is, every square and every cubic millimeter definitely helps. Like we've seen Samsung like stick around with the same battery capacity on their ultra models because internal space is limited and some stuff just consumes a fixed amount of space. For example, their S Pen, right? Things like that. And speakers are not getting smaller. Microphones are not getting smaller anytime soon. So while I'm not saying that this automatically excuses some of the weirdness of the design, in this render, I would argue it definitely looks weird. But I do believe it's not useless entirely. So still 0 frame drops. Let's put the video full screen.
Camera layout on the left. Why would they do this? I do not know. I have literally no idea. But how many times have you heard rumors that sound very good only for Apple to do the very not obvious thing and make it look goofy instead? What makes more sense to you, all right? A pretty iPhone or one that looks like this?
I mean, this could still look pretty. And by the way, what I was saying about the camera lenses, you can already see that it's kind of true even in this slightly different perspective render. You already don't even see like the LiDAR flash. So if it's actually full on black, this is something they don't actually mention, but that's seemingly the design they're going with here. This is not color matched to the rest of the back glass in the way the current camera bump is.
You tell me. Oh, and remember those two-tone rumors? Remember, I told you to save it for later. It's later now. If you look at this design, I think you can now see how that rumor could have been misinterpreted or misconstrued. The back of the phone will not look two-tone like this, for example.
It was never gonna look like this. By the way, no singular rumor ever pointed to this being like a special cutout in the back metal chassis. This was basically just an assumption on the side of the guys doing the 3D renders. Based on like 2 or 3 words in the original reporting.
But instead just appears more two-tone because that camera bar is the size of a large Papa John's pizza. As far as materials and such, that part is a bit less clear to us. According to the people who have told us things, the phones feel lighter and
So that's also an interesting detail. So what do we have? We have the dynamic island does not get smaller according to this leak. We do not know if there, whatever material choices Apple is making, we do not have like a clear separation right amidst the back glass that shows, oh, this is glass, this is aluminum, so that goes against it. We do have basically the confirmation that it's an elongated but also pretty tall camera bar, at least on the Pro models that still have 3 cameras. And now we have the confirmation or basically dimensioning of that phones feel lighter, which would suggest that Apple might be using a different material, but you never know. Apple could have gone with like a higher density battery, but then actually use that higher density to shrink down the battery, give you the same battery capacity as before, and save on weight, right? You never know.
Sources aren't sure if they're holding titanium or aluminum. I will say I'd hate for the Pro phones to backtrack away from titanium after a couple years of that, but who
I have said it time and time again. It's a similar thing to the Touch ID versus Face ID discussion, right? In the end, it really comes down to how is it implemented. Now, to me personally, Touch ID will probably never be as good as Face ID because, as I mentioned, my hands sweat just a tiny bit amount, always. To the point, I'm not like leaking here or anything. I'm not quite disgusting, but fingerprint sensors have never worked that well for me. In fact, my very first laptop was like some business version of it, that had the fingerprint sensor, and I was like going to my family and saying, I was very young, not really understanding of technology, and I was like, oh, that fingerprint sensor doesn't really work. And they tried it, and yeah, it obviously wasn't as good as Touch ID or later smartphone fingerprint sensors, but it did work with like a little bit of trying for them. It never really did for me. But I understand why discussions can go back and forth. I can say the same thing about titanium and aluminum. If Apple does not severely compromise the device's durability by going quote unquote back to aluminum, even though there has never been a Pro iPhone without a more premium material, I'm fine with that. I've already mentioned on multiple streams the other advantages that aluminum has over titanium. Let's even ignore weight and durability because aluminum kind of wins in weight if you are willing to compromise durability, and they're kind of equal because you can use thicker aluminum to mimic some of the strength of titanium, but at that point, why would you use very thick aluminum? Because at that point, you are also compromising stuff like radio frequency transparency if you make your metal chassis too thick. So that's back and forth. But the other points where aluminum clearly wins, and one of them is radio frequency transparency, but the biggest one is cooling. Titanium, while a tiny bit better than stainless steel, is pretty much garbage at heat dissipation. Aluminum is one of the best materials in the world for heat dissipation. It's worse than like silver and copper and shit like that, but those are way more expensive and stuff like this, so that they're not even really worth considering as a material for the outside chassis. So if Apple makes a lot more usage of aluminum, still gives us a very durable product. Yeah, it might not be as scratch resistant as titanium, but and for bending, you probably are never gonna apply enough pressure, especially if the products keep getting thicker. Like if the next iPhone goes potentially from like 8.25 millimeters to like closer to 9 millimeters, I just don't think you're gonna bend it in any realistic scenario for usage. To me, Apple has marketed titanium a lot. That's why I don't necessarily think they will move away from it anytime soon. But I do not agree that Apple should not move away from it specifically because they marketed it. That actually would be one of the points that people would criticize if they found out it was a Tim Cook decision, right? If Tim Cook was like saying, oh no, you engineers, you're telling me aluminum is better in almost every way, but no, I want to stick with titanium because it's better to market it. I just feel like if somebody at Apple were to found out to say this would be very negatively received. And for a channel like FPT that has been plenty critical of Apple, I just think that's a very weird mindset to have. You can agree or disagree with me on that, but I feel like people are often way more hypocritical than they think they are. They will gladly say and do things that they will gladly criticize others for.
No one cares what I want. I will say, though, that this design still leans a bit Google Pixel adjacent.
No, I'm sorry, but even as like one of my chatters pointed out, there have been designs somewhat similar to that. The Pixel this is where I would suggest that the knowledge of other smartphone brands is actually incredibly limited here at FPT, and it's very, very US-centric. because if you look at like the brands like Xiaomi, Vivo, Oppo, they all at some point have played around with some designs like that before ultimately somehow all ending up with the same circular camera design on the back. But no, it's not Google Pixel adjacent anymore. Just because it's an elongated camera bar, Google does not have the exclusive rights to that.
And I just want to ask, for why? I could be wrong, but this change seems so odd and impractical. It just seems like...
Again, this is... the word impractical is completely meaningless here, because now whether if you mean impractical potentially for the user, because again, as one of the chatters pointed out, if you hold it like this, usually your finger here, right? But let's say because the phone is now so big and stuff like that, while shooting a video, you now have your finger potentially here, potentially covering up of the microphone, the LiDAR scanner, the flash, whatever, right? But do you actually think Apple is pushing those components around for no reason whatsoever, right? Apple is the company, like, and this is, by the way, one thing where FPT is now being inconsistent themselves. They just said that this triangular camera arrangement exists because of how big the notch used to be, and even the dynamic island still eats into the space that would be basically here, which prevents this camera from moving up here, right? Or from all cameras to just be vertically on top, right? So now that he is saying, but before that design actually came out and people like analyzed what the phone is internally looking like, people were saying things like, "Oh, Apple is just changing to this triangular camera arrangement on the iPhone 11 Pro just for it to be different." But we found out, no, there were benefits like the equidistance between the individual cameras, which was really good for a very smooth camera transition. And they made space for the Face ID sensor while not eating up into the space too much of other components. So two and a half pretty good reasons. Here, he's basically implying that because he does not yet know the internal layout, he cannot think of anything else. Let's say the iPhone 17 Pro comes out, the processor is actually maybe pushed up a little words, right? And right around here, Apple has a 2 times thicker aluminum / copper / graphene heat sheet above it, right? And suddenly the iPhone goes from sustaining 4, 5, or maybe at best 6 watts of power consumption on the chip to sustaining around 8 watts. Right? Or sustaining 6 watts, but at much lower temperatures and at much higher display brightness, right? That would be the more likely thing that Apple would tune the chip for, right? That could be cool. What if the antenna improves greatly? Because now they can push it very much to the edges and still have all the space they need for all the other components, just because they gained just a few more cubic millimeters of space in there. And again, I know some people will argue that, oh, maybe you should just make the entire device thicker. But fact is that is seemingly not happening across any brand at all. In fact, the Chinese brands use their higher density batteries this year to make phones thinner. So it's not like Apple is unique to not suddenly want to make the first 1 centimeter thick phone. So if they are gonna make a camera, if they are gonna make the device thicker, they will have to find some workarounds, like just making a small portion of it thicker. Ducky Boy, welcome back to the stream.
Change for the sake of it. It's not offering any more utility, it's just making it look different. And different equals new, equals exciting.
That's actually something that Renee Ritchie addressed in the video where that we reacted to yesterday.
Equals money for Tim Cook, I guess.
And again, you are now shitting just on Tim Cook for a design choice. It's not like, yeah, he signs off on the design decision, but do you actually think that he dictated this specific design to the design team? This has literally never been reported as something that Tim Cook does.
It seems to me that Apple has somewhat become less influential and instead more so influenced.
Yeah, that is such horseshit because people always bring up one thing to prove that, and that is the AI stuff. And yes, Apple is a little bit reactionary when it comes to AI, catching up with what others are doing, trying to create a more unique spin on it, focusing more on privacy, focusing more on security, all the Apple stuff on top of other services. But Apple has always done stuff like this when it was necessary. Like iCloud was not the first cloud storage provider in the world, but the way it was integrated with every app was pretty great. And the fact that Apple still maintains higher privacy and security standards for it than the rest of the industry is pretty cool. So I'm just a little bit confused where like companies up until this day, many have just blindly copied the dynamic island on ColorOS. People have copied the control center from iOS 18. People have copied the name drop animation, I believe across 2 different Chinese Android skins. So while I'm not saying Apple is the unique hegemon in the smartphone space and nobody else provides anything that might be worth copying, in fact, that's not how it should be. That would be a terrible, terrible market where Apple could potentially ask 50, 60, 70% profit margins on hardware because nobody else is even remotely competitive. That would be a horrible market, and that's not how any market plays out. No car company is uniquely influential these days as they might have been during their early period, whether it's Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen, Audi, that's just German brands, Nissan, Toyota, Kia, Honda, Hyundai, right? All of those brands who at some point in their time have delivered pretty unique things, whether it's price or features or designs, now because they do have all of that competition from companies with similarly great histories, yeah, they will be sometimes a little bit more influenced too. Ducky Boy, they may be true, but that's the same story for all tech companies that all copy the others, and it makes sense. Remember, they all make phones for the same market. Yes, but I will argue, and I will argue strongly. For example, the reason why I cover Samsung differently, right? One UI 7 versus iOS 18, right? So you have a lot of design elements that are clearly influenced by iOS. And in fact, they even kind of copied the dynamic island and live activities a little bit, but the implementation is different. Even the position on the screen is a little bit differently. Usually these live animations are actually at the bottom. I actually didn't know you could put them at the top, right? But then in comparison to that, you have something like ColorOS 15. And I do believe that that is copying that goes too far. I do believe that old Steve Jobs quote about good artists copy, great artists steal, right? But you look at what One UI 7 we just looked at, and it had clearly a similar control center, but by no means the same. And yeah, by the way, I do agree with Mr. Who's the Boss. One UI 7 is absolutely influenced by the iPhone, and it is specifically designed to make it easier for a potential iPhone user to switch. But it's not this, right? It's not a one-to-one copy. Nerd World, hello Mark. I actually don't ever remember seeing your name in the chat. Hello Nerd, or hello World, or hello Nerd World, whatever you prefer, right? I don't remember if it was ColorOS or it was HyperOS, but like the name drop animation was like copied one-to-one on the system. Was it HyperOS? HyperOS Mi Beam. Is that the worst one? Oh, Jesus.
Ini bukan iPhone, tapi ini adalah Xiaomi dengan Hyper.
That was one that copied a little bit the idea, but then again, the idea also goes back to like something to like Samsung's nearby share back all the way back in the day. But there was like one company that like completely copied the name drop animation. Do you think HyperOS is too copied? Yeah, I do think HyperOS is not as bad as is there like good photos here? HyperRes is not as bad as ColorRes. I legitimately would say that ColorRes is unacceptably bad. Let's look at HyperRes as it loads here. HyperRes still has a lot of that stuff. Even the fact that they all switched at the same time to circular, smaller controls, even though, by the way, don't forget, previously they used to be rounded squares, squircles, and I loved them that way. And I was angry that Apple switched them around from iOS 17 to iOS 18 to look that way. This is why every control center element I use is actually an elongated rectangle. I don't use any circular ones. But everybody else who previously was copying stuff like the squircles immediately went to something like squares, from the squircles to full-on circles. And you can see like design elements like the Play Now thing. It's one-to-one. And I just don't like when it's exactly one-to-one. And this is why I was saying I do believe that One UI 7 might be iOS inspired. I do not think it's a one-to-one copy. I think Samsung right now is one of the better Android companies when it comes to that. Nerd World, remember me? I tried upload from YouTube Studio. Oh, yeah, now I remember. Did you have a different name back then? Same slow update. Oh, so the YouTube Studio app didn't help you. Which is HEVC instead of MP4. That could actually be true because HEVC is HEVC would have to be translated, I believe, to AV1 internally. So you are not actually limited on the upload speed. You're limited on the internal encoding / decode of YouTube. At least I think I am. But honestly, I mean, look, I always say to people, when it comes to your work or even like your hardcore hobby, if it actually helps you to switch operating systems or at least a specific piece of hardware, do it. Like, I cannot tell you what to do in that regard. At my work, I use a Windows PC. I believe the app from IBM, when it comes to managing medical systems, does not even exist on Mac in the exact same way. So, I obviously do not dictate you. But it's interesting because I've also heard from creators that YouTube stuff on Android is also really problematic. So I couldn't tell you if it is going to get automatically a lot better if you switch. But if you have to switch, that's obviously I'm not encouraging anyone to suffer an inferior experience. If it's something very important to you, I could recommend maybe getting like a secondary Android device, maybe a cheap one, maybe even like an Android tablet rather than a smartphone, just transferring that file over from iOS and then uploading it there. But that's up to you, of course. It depends on how much you're even attached to iOS or something like that. HyperOS had round control center before Apple, but I get your point. Yeah, it's not... I know I ramble sometimes. I understand that they had some of those design elements before, but it's the specific arrangement. It's the fact that the icons look the same. That is how it's all how about it comes together, right? I'm not saying like if somebody just copied that volume and those volume and brightness sliders, I wouldn't say anything about it. Because look, how many ways are there truly to slide up or down or left or right to make the display brighter or the volume louder or not? But it's everything else. It's the similar icons, like even look, like dark mode. Truly, you couldn't think of anything else. It's almost identical to the iPhone. I understand at least like Bluetooth and airplane mode, there's a limitation to what you can do. But even the animations, right? For example, when you click on the silence switch, the mute switch in Control Center, it jiggles around and then it turns black or white, right? And on these systems, I'm not sure if HyperOS or ColorOS, the animation is basically the same. Apple has like this specific like rubber band animation where if you move something a little bit too far, right, it will almost like bounce back a little. They copied that too. And I'm like, guys, there are different ways to do things. Of course, that multitasking bar down below, it's that on Android in general, right? You can even argue, oh, that's line predates the iPhone or whatever. But the specific multitasking gestures that we now have on Android are basically one-to-one copies of what was introduced on the iPhone 10. In fact, Android tried very, very different controls back in the day, but then they gave up and just copied iOS because that's what people got used to. That's what people actually liked. And that's how it all played out. And I'm not too much against it, because ultimately some things you have to copy, because otherwise you really end up confusing customers. But you really don't have to copy small shit like that. Nerdword, almost going to pull the trigger with S25U. Do you think it's worth it? I would argue, if you really are somebody who cares about like high-end tech, it depends. I do prefer Samsung's One UI over the rest, what's currently in the Android world. But if you really care about something like camera hardware, or even like cooling capabilities so you can game for longer, obviously very soon you'll get like the Vivo X200 Ultra, the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, the Oppo Find X8 Ultra, right? So, and of all those Ultra devices, the Samsung will be in many specs the worst and the most expensive one simultaneously. So you might actually just get a way better deal with one of those other Chinese devices. But Nerd World, Ducky Boy will also gladly give you some recommendations to buy or not.
Apple Intelligence was rushed out.
So Apple Intelligence is that one thing that people argue for. That Apple has become reactionary and they launch features before they are ready. Now, I have already given counterpoints to all of that, because I believe a lot of that was like brought up in Tylosive Tech's Apple has become IBM video. But my point still stands. Apple cannot ignore artificial intelligence. It's way too big a part of the current market. People, unlike what some nerds online believe, and that's not an insult to you, nerd world, people do want AI. They do not want too much AI. They do not want AI in literally everything they do, but they do want some of the coolness of AI, whether it's ChatGPT being a super advanced voice assistant just to play around, but also smaller features that you might have previously just called algorithms, right? Cleanup, arguably, sure, it does have some generative fill, but for a lot of people, it's just a useful feature that is part of the Apple Intelligence umbrella. A better Siri, that's hopefully coming with iOS 18.4, is well appreciated. It doesn't have to be like a full-on ChatGPT thing, but having deeper system control, using more natural language rather than like pre-learned phrases, all of that will help. And just playing around with stuff like one thing that I have noticed on iOS 18, and that's my phone is using like a bi-language keyboard, right? It's German and English in one. And one thing that I've really seen is that on iOS 18, English grammar is dramatically better than it has ever been. Like, I write a small text and I don't even have Apple Intelligence, but I guess it's even better with Apple Intelligence, especially if you ask it to specifically do it. But it will just go back to like a comma that was wrong, or maybe I just somewhere wrote do instead of does or whatever. And yes, while those are basic things, they are getting better, and people want those things to get better. Some of those things might become hardware limited down the line, as rather than just base them on basic algorithms, they become based on transformer-based large language models. So Apple had to react here. You don't want Apple to sit on a pedestal so far above the rest that they are not even considering competing in a very important new wave of technology. You don't want that. You wouldn't want Apple to not have a more advanced telephoto camera these days, right? Imagine if the iPhone stayed on like a super old 12 megapixel, and then by 12 megapixel I mean like really small sensor too, like 2x telephoto, right? Like, what would be the purpose of that if you also have next to it a gigantic 48 megapixel main sensor with far better optics, where you can even zoom in into 1/4 of the sensor and still get better quality? Right, you do want Apple to deliver something like an alternative to Periscope with tetraprism. You do want Apple to experiment with stuff like sensor shift optical image stabilization, so the image is sharp and can collect a lot of light even in low light conditions. So you do want Apple to be a little reactionary, and sometimes that includes having to wait a little. And this is actually one thing that I promised I would react very early on, and that is I have brought up in previous streams examples of where Apple launched features later than the hardware, right? One particular example would be portrait modes, or it would even be whatever that mode was that was like used to take sweater photos, right? Like that was really good at medium light conditions before Apple unified all their algorithms into one. But look at, for example, at the state of, let's actually go away from image search. I'll just go here. Let's switch to English. One UI 7, for example, right? Let's consider you're a Galaxy S24 owner or a Galaxy S23 owner, something like that, or even you own a foldable. Well, the Galaxy S25 series just launched with One UI 7. It seems to have still a few bugs. Like, I've seen some videos where the animations just stop working. There are also questions about like very inconsistent battery life, not where it gets super terrible on one end, but where you really get like huge 25% swings, and in the better results it matches, sometimes even slightly beats the 16 Pro Max, but then for a lot of times, probably due to the software, it utterly underperforms the 16 Pro Max, sometimes even like the 15 Pro Max. And you know why this makes sense? Because apparently the Galaxy S24, not all of Samsung devices, but the Galaxy S24, last year's flagship, the flagship that was promised to get 7 years of full-on software updates, it does still have to go through an elongated One UI 7 upgrade beta cycle, with Beta 4 coming in February, so still this month, Beta 5 coming in March, and Beta 6 coming in April. And that's just for the Galaxy S24. If you're like a Galaxy A50 something owner, I believe it's A56 or whatever, or even like you have a 2-year-old flagship, a Galaxy S23 Ultra with more than enough memory, a decent Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip, you don't even know when you're gonna get any of this. You might have to wait until June or July. What about Galaxy S22 owners, which are also still supposed to get a One UI 7? No idea, right? And somehow it's okay for Samsung to launch a new phone that utterly Fs with all of their update promises for their previous devices, not because they changed the years around, but what do I get from having many years of software updates if I get them basically as like a second or third class citizens months and months and months after the regular flagship? And don't forget, One UI 7 is actually based on Android 15. Right now, you know what's in beta? Android 16. So by the time it actually comes out, we will be close to the official release of Android 16, because apparently Google decided to launch 2 Android versions this year. So we might actually have Android 16 come out and Android 17 being announced by the time most Samsung devices get like an Android 15 based update in One UI 7. This is insane. It partially comes from the big lineups that they have, sure, and I am not angry that the Galaxy A50 phones get updates a little bit later than the Galaxy S flagships, but we're literally talking about the Galaxy S24, this first Android phone to get a guaranteed 7 years of updates, to not get One UI 7 the same month as the Galaxy S25 comes out, not a month later, maybe not even 2 months later. Because technically, the Galaxy S25 Ultra came out at the very, very end of January, but the Galaxy S24 is getting a beta in April. So that could mean we get like the official version of like very late April, which would be 3 months after the S25 gen came out, or it could be maybe very early May, right? A lot of stuff has been delayed thus far with One UI 7, so who knows? A few weeks here or there wouldn't surprise me. Would it surprise you? This is what I'm talking about. This is stuff that gets maybe 1/100 of the attention of the fact that, oh, Apple Intelligence, and people will say, well, but Apple Intelligence was talked about with the iPhone marketing, right? Sure, and I can see the criticisms for that, but can you see the criticisms for this? Because Samsung has promised for years now to speed up their update cycles. They have promised long years of software updates, which now are basically less meaningful because you're treated so much worse than the current generation. Imagine having a 2-year-old device now, a product that gets like supposedly 7 years of updates. How long do you think it will take for a 5-year-old product to get the latest OS? Will it be a full year after the flagship come out? What is then the point of that? So I guess Samsung dominating Android market in flagship devices. Well, they are and kind of are not. It is very region specific, where Samsung definitely is the most powerful in the West. But definitely with flagships too. And in the US, I would argue they probably dominate the entire Android market. But then in China and in India, they definitely do not. Yes, sure, they might still have like the most relevant model. But if you combine, for example, the Galaxy, if you combine the Vivo X200 Pro, later Ultra, the Xiaomi Pros and Ultras, and you compare them against the Galaxy, yeah, in those markets, at the very least, they are competitive. But for example, when you look at smartphone top 10 sales, top 10 sales news by the vendor, that's actually not a bad piece of data. So when it comes to the top-selling models, this was actually one of the first time that a Galaxy S Ultra, so very expensive flagship, joined the top 10. Now, the iPhone obviously usually has like last year's devices because they sell throughout most of the year. And then September, October, November, they accumulate a lot of sales for like the latest Pro Max devices and Pro devices. But usually the devices that you find in the lineup on the Android side, for one, they're Samsung devices, but they're also Samsung's cheapish devices and then Samsung's super cheap devices. So we're literally looking at like the Galaxy A54 and the Galaxy A14, and then transitioning to the Galaxy A15 5G and A15. So we actually lost the Galaxy A50 series, but that's probably because more people chose the flagship. So yeah, Samsung definitely is still the most relevant Android brand worldwide.
Intelligence was rushed out as a response to the pressure from all of the other major tech companies diving into AI. This was a rare occurrence happening right in front of us of Apple not doing the typical Apple thing, which is usually, we know we're late on these features, but when we put it out, it'll be the best of them. And for this, they didn't do that. They did the opposite, reacting to external pressure and just developing out in public, actively working on...
Yeah, the problem is developing in public is not always bad. There are certain things that Apple has even open sourced very often, like for example the Swift coding language and shit like that. There's no, like, I feel like whenever people try to say that all things should work the exact same way, I disagree. For example, right now there is a big competition on the side of big tech companies for talented AI developers and engineers, right? So for Apple to not have anything AI related or modern AI related, generative AI related, LLM related, transformer LLM related on the market by 2024 could have meant that they could be losing out on the next generation of engineers to join Apple, right? They would all be going to NVIDIA, Google, OpenAI, right? So sometimes you have to pre-announce something. You have to maybe launch something a little bit earlier than you would otherwise like to. Those are normal things in the market, and Apple has also been subject to them in the past. We tend to look at Apple's past sometimes with like very naive perspectives, where we forget like Apple had failures under Steve, under Tim, more failures arguably under Steve than under Tim, because back in the day a lot of those markets were less figured out. So I'm just a little bit confused when people present AI as like this uniquely bad thing for Apple. It's arguably uniquely large. It's like it's probably the largest new tech trend that Apple has joined, like, because smartphones, that was not really a trend. Like, yeah, we had smarter phones, but not quite smartphones in the same way as the iPhone was. App stores, again, we had stores for digital downloads, and again, when Apple joined it, they definitely switched that around. But with AI, there is a big question of what you can even do very differently. I think that Apple's biggest contribution, hopefully with iOS 18.4 and hopefully by iOS 19, will be to have a very capable, mostly on-device working digital assistant that is very capable of controlling your apps. Like, I know Samsung lets you control a lot of stuff now with Galaxy AI. They let you even basically work with one piece of data or inputs across multiple apps. Like famously that example where they say, hey, Galaxy, add like search the web for like the latest football events of this team and add them to my calendar, right? So it kind of did a Google search and then added them to the calendar. And then you can even like follow that up with like saying, oh, and please create alarms 2 hours before those events actually happen, right? So that's cool. But when it comes to actually like super deep system controls, and also when it comes to apps that people actually really like using, this is where Apple will have an advantage. Their ecosystem is very tightly integrated. People who use Apple services and Apple apps usually use a whole host of Apple services and Apple apps. So, but again, I will obviously reserve judgment for the official release of iOS 18.4 and then whatever new version of Siri comes out with iOS 19. I'm not saying Apple will be perfect by the time they launch it, but Apple has never been perfect. They've always just been better than the rest in many ways. Not always. So, yeah, I feel like this is a very common thing with John and FPT. Must I remind you that one of the ways that really made me care about like reaction videos and stuff was actually Tylosive Tech disputing what FPT was saying back in the day about how Apple has changed.
On and tweaking Apple Intelligence while it's already in your hand. That's why this new design for iPhone 17 Pro is also weird to me. It's doing a lot less influencing and more being influenced. So yes,
but you didn't even show like a very similar design. Like my chat is better at finding out similar designs than you did for like a video where you could have done prior research.
While new iPhone changes are exciting, does Apple really get to feed us the same phone year after year after year?
But how is it the same phone? I really don't get it. The screens have gotten larger with slimmer bezels, have gotten larger. We have gotten more cameras, better cameras with better image signal processors to process that data. We have gotten larger batteries that charge faster, that use wireless charging, that give you MagSafe compatibility to a whole set of new accessories. We went from few buttons with like a mute switch to a mute switch turning to the action button, to camera controls, to customizable shortcuts like double and triple tap on the back. Like a lot of things have changed. Even the flash on the iPhone 15 series is dramatically better than on previous generations. Or I'm not sure which generation was the exact change. Maybe it was the 14, but I got it on my 15. And that like crazy iOS 18 deep control of what your flash can do, that is something that is possible thanks to newer hardware. Like even back in the day when LiDAR scanner was introduced, people were asking, what was it for exactly? You can do very precise augmented reality. You can measure things in the real world. It helps with focusing for the camera. Yes, you could take it away and you probably could find some workarounds for it, but it's still something that shows the phones are not exactly the same year to year to year to year.
And then receive any amount of credit for this being the change that they decide to
But this is a change that I don't even care about, right? Unless it actually looks bad in the real world. If it contributes to Apple having a little bit more internal space for something like chip cooling, that's all I need to justify such a change. Like ultimately, there is only so much you can do, and asking for change on your site right now kind of sounds like you're asking for change's sake.
make? That I'm not so sure about. You know what I am sure about?
Okay, sponsor time or whatever. The reason why I wanted to mention that old video is actually, it really got me into front page tech. I think there are actually two reaction videos. Apple Sheep reacts to Apple Sucks, right? So, and this video is 6 years old. So these discussions about Apple supposedly not being what it once used to be, apparently the trajectory was not bad enough for like John Prosser to fully switch to Android during all that time, even though I know he tried. I'm probably not going to watch the entirety of the video, but it's probably worth showing you guys a little bit of it.
So you may realize that we've done 2 response videos in a row, but that's mostly because we've discovered responding to other YouTubers happens to be what you guys like enjoying the most, or don't like.
Believe it's one
Either
of the
way,
more
we like
popular
getting
videos on
people
this channel.
passionate about certain things, and this was the next YouTuber a lot of people were asking me to respond to and talk to. Now, before getting into the response of this video, I want reminders for everyone out there who doesn't get the point of me responding to other YouTubers. It is not because I hate them. It is not because I despise them. It's not because I'm trying to be cynical. I'm just trying to have a conversation, which is
Same here.
enjoyable to me. I still have massive
Sometimes I'll
respect
be
for this
very
YouTuber.
critical,
I don't
but
want them
more
to
often
die. I
than
don't
not,
want
I'm
to hurt
just
them.
happy
I'm not
to
trying to be
start a
salty. We're just
conversation.
seeing success in this type of genre, so we're trying out something different and seeing how you guys will like it. If you like it, don't like it, please just let us know. But without further ado, this is a video by Front Page Tech titled "The Truth About Apple and iPhone 10. Apple Sucks Now and It's Your Fault." Seeing that title, I was
So iPhone 10. So we are basically looking at an over 6-year-old video.
oh, this I have to be into. If it's my fault, this is being taken personally. So let's go forward with it.
Apple sucks now. And before all you Apple fanboys...
So this was before a lot of weight loss for John Prosser. Good on him. That was also when he tried to be a more like controversial YouTuber, I would say. That was when he was really hardcore criticizing Apple, and afterwards he was hardcore leaking Apple. He's kind of trying both things a little bit again, so this is why this video really came to mind.
say, you don't know what you're talking about. You're just so biased towards Android.
That's me right there.
Yep.
See, you could just put my
Yeah, that's me, guys.
face there, but I might comment that exact thing. Nah, we're good.
I've been reporting on tech for years now, and for a very long time, I was a die-hard Apple fan. Yes, I switched to Android. I currently use
So that switch was ultimately overturned. So something in Tim Cook's leadership since the iPhone 10, never mind one of the best updates ever in iPhone history, something has gotten better since then?
Android, but I only switched because I felt like I had to because iOS was so sloppy.
I really don't
So
want
iOS was sloppy. Might I remind you, this was iOS 10/iOS 11 days. And yes, while I know that iOS 11 had its issues, and this is why iOS 12 famously was kind of like a macOS Snow Leopard refinement year, iOS 12 did not fundamentally change Apple's fortune for forever. iOS 13 had like a big messy launch right after it. Angelica joining the chat saying hello to everyone. It's a very interesting topic. Well, now we have switched topics a little bit, but thank you so much. And yeah, you can finally join us saying hello too.
want more people to keep using that as an excuse. One of the most common rebuttals I've seen in the YouTube comments, at least on my videos, is I hate Apple now, or Apple sucks, and by the way, I own these Apple products. That's not a counterpoint. I get that you're trying to say that, you know, I've tried Apple products myself, but realize that's a two-way street and it doesn't really work. Just because of the fact that I've bought and reviewed a Google Pixel doesn't make me any less biased against Google, and I don't try to hide that.
Well, the bias obviously is better if it's informed by actual like usage, rather than like by absorbing internet talking points. Let me actually fix one thing very quickly. Going to OBS. Still 0 frame drop, so whatever I did last stream seems to be working. And let me move my head down.
I'm very definitely biased against them, but buying and reviewing the product doesn't change that fact. Same with Samsung phones. I think they're good, but they're definitely not as good as my iPhone just because I bought and owned one. In fact, too, the Note 7 and the S8 doesn't change the fact that I'm biased against them. They don't run iOS. I like iOS. If you're biased against iOS, saying that you've owned an iPhone doesn't really change that.
So when I say Apple sucks now, I'm literally comparing today's version of Apple to Apple from years ago. I've always set them a much higher standard than everybody else, and that's not my fault. That's because they set the standard.
No, that's actually your fault. The problem is if you're saying I want Apple to be 100% of what is possible, and Apple gives you 90%, right? And you cannot accept Apple to be like less bad than 5% deviation, right? But if somebody else, you expect them to be only 90% good, and they deliver you 80%, they still delivered you worse things, right, in the end, even though the gap technically from what you expected to what you got was the same. That's not how it works. This is, by the way, why when some people in my comment section ask me like, oh, I want this thing to work, I'm like, yes, it's absolutely fine. If you know that everything you need is better on Android or is better on Windows, right, that's absolutely fine with me. But whenever people switch for like one specific thing on the other operating system or an entire different ecosystem, I have to warn those people, you might get that one better thing, but and the grass always seems greener on the other side for a reason, right? But once you're actually there, you start seeing the smaller flaws that were so easy to overlook when you were not actually using those devices.
And now every year they become more and more disappointing. It's like a really, really great TV show that has always been good and we all love it, but now they're on season 9.
Might I say, he is saying that about the iPhone 10. One of the biggest redesigns in smartphone history.
And it's kind of rough, and the writers are getting really, really lazy, but we're all afraid to admit that it's bad now.
If he's referring to The Office Season 9, then I agree. But in regards to Apple setting the standard, we as a culture kind of decide that. Most people buy Apple products. That's why most people consider Apple the standard. No, that is not just on you, but I kind of want to make sure we all realize Apple is not the ones deciding that they are the standard. If everyone started buying some other brand, then that would be the standard. We as a culture have decided that. But I think me and him probably agree on that.
None of the tech reviewers or tech experts tell you the truth anymore. They drool over anything new and fancy. You know why? Because you drool over it, and it gets them views.
I recently had a collaboration with Painfully Honest Tech, and we kind of brought up this point that tech reviewers, no matter your opinion on Apple, you can only win. Whether you hate Apple, you get views, you get clicks, or whether you love Apple, you get views, you get clicks. And first of all, I'd like to know what all these YouTubers are that drool over Apple products, because at least in the field of...
is it like, and I know this is an older video, but even back in the day, like iPhone was like the default phone to cover, but like who was drooling over it without any criticism? Like iJustine of the biggest guys? like MKBHD was always presenting the other side. Mr. Who's the Boss, I'm not even sure if he was that active back in the day, but he was always presenting the other side. And again, this is not something I actually want to analyze fully. I don't have the time. I still want to go to the gym today. But yeah, I just wanted to say these narratives and that kind of like reactionary thinking about Apple, specifically from John Prosser, has been there for quite a while, and he just never backs it up fully, in my opinion. Now, we've talked actually a lot about Apple Intelligence, and one last thing that I wanted to cover today is actually Apple Intelligence in China, because seemingly what Apple decided to do this week, and again, a lot of it is coming from Bloomberg, so it's not like official, but I think that Apple was fine with leaking all of that. But we had like the chief of Alibaba confirming that Apple Intelligence is being built in partnership with them for China. We now know from Bloomberg that Apple is also relying at least partially on Baidu, which is kind of like the Google of China. So seemingly, similarly, how they cannot fully avoid Google in the West, they seemingly cannot fully avoid Baidu in China. And I'm not going to read everything to you, but basically it's going to be still an on-device system that will, but it will have a lot of like basically Chinese influence. So it will prevent you from being as free as you might be with like Western's Apple AI models. It will also be very specific to like models that Apple ships to China. So if you import or you move to China with an Android, with an iOS device, and then enable Chinese AI there, it seemingly won't work. Maybe that will change over time. I don't see why it shouldn't, but that's very interesting. So for visual intelligence, that will be handled by Baidu, similar to how ChatGPT, Google Lens is kind of integrated with visual intelligence. Whether it means that Baidu sits on top of Siri or actually Alibaba, because Alibaba is actually deeply integrated. It's not integrated the way that ChatGPT is integrated into Siri right now in the West, but it's actually like building all that AI stuff with Apple and basically teaching Apple what the Chinese government is fine with or not. That's obviously problematic, but there's no real way around it. That's just how the Chinese market works. And a lot of stuff in China will be more dependent on private cloud compute, but those servers will have to run in China. So yeah, there are some differences. We'll have to see exactly how it plays out. Maybe China will lift certain restrictions for Apple down the line, because don't forget, Apple doesn't do as much like search stuff as the rest. Like Apple does not have a YouTube, Apple does not have a Google search. So China would be probably less interested in like dictating to Apple what they can integrate in terms of their own LLMs. But when it comes to the restrictions, this is where Apple will be basically forced to partner up with at least one Chinese company. We've seen it with like DeepSeek, where like if you looked for something like Tiananmen Square, we're getting highly censored results. I actually got good results from DeepSeek, and right while I was doing another search inside it, it actually deleted the shit that I had previously looked at. So that was pretty crazy. I wish I had like video screen recording on while it was happening. But yeah, I just wanted to cover that. So hopefully next week we'll actually be getting iOS 18.4 beta 1. If it hasn't yet happened today, I'm pretty sure it's not happening this week anymore. But seemingly Apple is kind of leaking internally how their Chinese AI stuff will look like. And of course, expected to also come to French, German, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, Spanish, and Vietnamese. That's of course on top of all the different English versions already, and with them a lot of the countries that speak those languages. So that will be quite a multi-billion people rollout right away. So that's fun, and I think iOS 18.4 is probably the real kind of first like big way for Apple Intelligence to prove itself. I think worldwide coverage will be very interesting. I think Siri will be very interesting. And I think second or third versions of their LLMs for features like cleanup will also be interesting. Because don't forget, Apple could probably replicate a lot of the generative fill functionality from stuff like Galaxy AI. They choose not to do so. Their executives deliberately talked about it. But if they feel like a demand from consumers for it, they will do so. And when it comes to stuff like Image Playground, I just think that they will keep it inferior always, because Apple just doesn't like to work with any potentially controversial material. Like, they won't let you generate nudes. They won't let you generate stuff that is related to existing IP. Like, I've seen people do like Mario-based emojis and shit like that. That's just not something Apple wants to do. They know if there's ever a target for like a large lawsuit, it's them. So expect Image Playground to probably always be the least interesting thing. I think Genmoji will be fun. I think they're already quite fun, and they're going to be even more fun when no matter with whom you chat with in the world, as long as they have one of those languages, you will also be able to send and receive Genmoji with them. I know you can send Genmoji already, but I just feel like it's very limiting if, especially for me, like I chat with people in the United States, in the United Kingdom, across Europe, obviously. And even if I can use Genmoji on my Mac, it feels always bad when I know, oh, I cannot get a Genmoji back from somebody else. And it also feels bad on my iPhone when I get like a Genmoji from somebody in the US, in the UK, but they know I cannot send one back because I don't have Apple Intelligence on my iPhone, only on my Mac. So yeah, there's a lot of like very human stuff, very psychological stuff, and I'm very glad that Apple Intelligence is expanding for that reason. And maybe iOS 18.4 will be so good in that regard that people like John Prosser will be happy for another 5 minutes before they find something else that is yet another ruin for Apple. Not to say that Apple doesn't deserve criticisms for certain things, they definitely do, but I would, as I've said it in prior videos, I prefer those criticisms, for one, to be fact-based, and I also prefer them to actually be presented in an interesting way. And I know the word constructive gets overused, but honestly, there was very little constructive criticism in what we just saw from FPT. Whether we're talking about the video for the iPhone 17 Pro or for the iPhone 10, by the way. Yeah, but that's about it for today. Let me briefly look if there's anything new. So iPhone SE4 with Apple Intelligence, Mac rumors, anything here? Still Prime Video app redesign. Nothing new. So seemingly iOS 18.4 beta 1 has not released today. That's a bummer. So I guess we'll have actually some stuff to cover next week. I'm actually gone for the weekend next week, but I might get to do at least one stream. So Wednesday I definitely can do, and then on Thursday I might do one if I get a little bit earlier off from work, but I'll let you know the details once we actually get to that. Thank you guys so much. It was a super lively live chat today. More people joining than usual. I know we'll probably get even more people next week when the iPhone SE actually goes live. If we get more rumors in the meantime, like maybe on Sunday's Power On newsletter by Mark Gurman, maybe he'll go into detail about the iPhone SE. Maybe he'll go into detail about iOS 18.4. Maybe on Tuesday we'll get iOS 18.4. So I'm prepared to stream quite a bit until Wednesday, and then I'll let you know my plans for Thursday, Friday, and up to Sunday. So thank you so much for everything. As always, one last shout out to do all the YouTube jazz, as we call it around here. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it out to anybody anybody who think might enjoy it. Comment. Don't just comment live. Also comment afterwards. That helps a lot with the algorithm. And whenever you catch me live, consider leaving a super chat or a super sticker. Any small donation goes a long way to help this channel. You can also become a Patreon or a supporter right here on YouTube. However you choose to support me or engage with this community, it's all very much appreciated. And as always, let me know what you would like to see me cover next. And I'll see you then. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.